Welcome, everyone. This meeting will be recorded if you aren't able to stay on the whole time or if you have neighbors that also are interested in the topic. So we're glad that you're here. This is an issue that the current council heard a lot about for years, and we included it as part of our goals and objectives in 2023-2025. So this team, Dixon, started working on it in addition to the city proactively restriping streets and instituted time parking. So there's been many, many steps and actions that have led us to this moment. There was work with the community stakeholders over the last year plus to create, and this is what you'll be hearing, and to provide input on a permit program that balances the many needs of the community. So that's what's being shared tonight. This is a really exciting time. While no program is ever perfect, we do believe that this has that balance and that will really speak to the issue of too many cars, not too many cars in a small space. So we hope that you are supportive of these efforts and look forward to hearing your questions and your input. And I will turn it over to Councilmember Yoranz Gulati, who I think is going to say a few words as well. Welcome.
Yes, thank you so much, Mayor. I'm Maika Yoranz Gulati, the council member in District 1. I'm very happy to be here tonight with all of you. I really want to thank you for being here. I know there are like a lot of things going on in our lives right now, and really appreciate you being here, because this is an initiative that we are really trying to listen to the community, coming up with different solutions. As Mayor Kate mentioned, we've been working with a task force for about 4 years, but although I know that this issue has been in the city for many years before I joined the city council, but I really want to appreciate our task force that is helping us identify some of the solutions. Also, I'm grateful for Dixon, who's here today, and they will guide you through the process. But I think it's been really important to take this initiative from the moment we had a lot of different studies done. So they have look at all the different resources, all the different studies, and take it moving forward, and really being creative, trying to find solutions. So this parking permit study is still in its early stages and nothing has been decided yet. This is where we want your input and your feedback to ensure that all the community voices are here. And so we come up with the best solution that hopefully it will help. This issue is very complicated. There are too many cars and not enough parking spots, and we're just trying to figure out a solution that will help alleviate the issues that we are facing here. So again, thank you so much, everybody, for being here tonight. And I really want to introduce Julie from Dixon. She's going to guide us through the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you both very much, and for being such active participants throughout this process. I wanted to just call out before we jump into the presentation, for those folks that might need Spanish interpretation, I wanted to make sure that you notice the interpretation icon on the Zoom menu, and you can select that option and select the Spanish option for translation services. And you can also ask questions also in Spanish. So we just wanted to make sure that everybody had a chance that needed interpretation services, that you could utilize that interpretation option again on the Zoom menu. I am, for some reason, having internet issues. So for right now, I'm going to turn my camera off just for fear of wanting to make sure that we make it through the presentation. And so with that, I'm going to ask my colleague Jennifer to please advance the slide. And as we move forward, we would also ask that if you will hold your questions until the end, everybody will have a chance to ask their questions. I also would like to share that everyone has and is entitled to their own opinions. Your opinions might vary from others, and understand that there might be a whole variation of thoughts and ideas. We welcome and hear from everyone, and we just ask that everybody be respectful, that if those opinions aren't equal to your own, that we still give everybody a fair chance to share that. We will also today be talking about the public survey that will be published tomorrow. We'll have all that information at the end of the presentation, and my colleague will also be monitoring the chat So if at any point anyone wanted to put a comment into the chat box, we will keep our eye on the chat also throughout the presentation. So again, my name is Julie Dixon. I'm joined by my colleague, Jennifer, and we have been working on this project now for quite some time. And I know that many of you have lived in San Rafael for quite some time and can appreciate that there is no one-size-fits-all fix to this very challenging issue. And what we hope to do today is navigate some of the ideas and options. And as the council member shared, we are not through this project yet, and this is why this meeting today and the public survey is so critical to our next steps, so that we can hear your all's feedback and incorporate that into the overall recommendations as we move this equitable solution forward. So Jennifer, if you'll go to the next slide, I'd appreciate it. So when we talk about RPP, Residential Parking Permit Program, and the overall goals for the RPP as it relates to the city, it really comes down to accessibility. We want to be sure that we have equitable access to residential parking, especially during those peak parking hours. Those peak parking hours, given that you all live it, can appreciate that those are our evening hours when you come home from a typical workday, you know, for supper time. And those overnights, especially on the weekends when maybe we want to have guests over to entertain, it's important that when we talk about equitable access is to make sure that we're thinking about those peak times so that there is curb space available to everyone that lives in and around the neighborhoods. And so we talk about accessibility, it's really about decreasing parking congestion in the residential neighborhoods and also thinking about increased safety and being able to optimize the utilization of the existing parking supply. And wherever it's possible is increasing the residential public parking supply. And this includes being able to look at available parking assets in nearby areas that we might be able to take advantage of. It's also important when we talk about the program goals is that we consider equity. And this is important when you consider the context of each neighborhood and the different use cases to ensure that on-street parking serves the community equitably. And we also need to think about affordability. We want to make sure that when we talk about the impact and making sure that there's available parking to everyone, and it's important when we talk about a program like residential parking permits, is that we're looking at cost neutrality. It's important when we think about Proposition 26, which passed back in 2010, is that a parking permit cannot be considered another tax upon residents. And when we design any type of solution regarding parking permits in residential neighborhoods, we want to really try to look at that cost balance to make sure that the program pays for itself. And we talk about the program, it goes well beyond just the signs and the parking permits themselves. It comes down to the administration of the program, the compliance of the program, the enforcement of the program, and everything associated with that. So being able to ensure that these types of parking permit solutions are accessible for all is also an important outcome of this overall project. Next slide, Jennifer. So when we talk about the project timeline, it was important to recognize that as we have gone through this project, there's been not only the initial assessment of the neighborhoods throughout the East San Rafael area, but also data collection. Data is an important driver as we talk about being able to make effective recommendations for the community. And as we've gone through these early stages with the task force and the steering committee, it was to really come up with some initial concepts. And I will share again, your council has been very actively involved in these discussions. It's quite evident that this is an impact in your neighborhoods and something that has been going on for quite some time. And so this level of engagement from many representatives of your community has been very well heard and very well represented. And that's why I like to share that there's no one-size-fits-all solution for this. We have not only geographic implications of the way that the area is designed, but also some of the density challenges. So when we talk about trying to come up with a holistic solution, it's really important when we talk about these steps. The financial projections is really when we talk about that sustainable model, when we talk about the design of the overall program. And that's how we've gotten to this current draft of the recommendations that we want to talk about here, because now it's really about getting your feedback, getting the survey done, getting that feedback implemented, incorporated into these recommendations so that ultimately we can finalize the recommendations and take those recommendations moving forward to City Council with the objective of being able to get to Council sometime in March, with the overall implementation ideally taking place in the early part of spring. Next slide, Jennifer. Sorry, I lost my point there. And then for the agenda tonight, one of the things that we want to start off with is the core program elements. Then we'll get into some of the specific additional elements for East San Rafael, and then getting into some additional program elements for consideration. And then we'll talk about the actual financial impacts. Next slide, Jennifer. So now we'll start off with is the core program elements for the proposed residential parking permit program for East San Rafael and Bret, Harte. Next slide. So some considerations come into the supply and demand analysis. As you all can appreciate, there is only so much curb space. There is only so much land when we talk about the actual inventory of on-street and off-street inventory. So there is sufficient parking supply to accommodate the residential parking demand, but the RPP program would strive to basically rebalance parking demand between the neighborhoods. And when we talk about on-street parking, we have to be mindful of the fact that on-street parking is a public asset and all households must share access while considering their existing off-street access. One of the things that I can share with you is working with projects across the country. Oftentimes we have communities that like to believe that that space out in front of their home belongs to them, but we have to remind everyone of the fact that that is not the case. We wanted to highlight that assuming the usage for private parking basically would suggest that there was 1 permit per household, if that was the max. We have 2,884 housing units, but there's only 2,047 public parking spaces. So when we start to look at how that balance basically plays out, these are some of the outcomes when we start to talk about making recommendations. As we go to the next slide, Jennifer. So when we talk about parking utilization, one of the things that we did is we actually collected data, and you can see by the color coding of the curb faces that you can see that we are exceeding what is considered 85% occupancy. For anyone that's heard me present before, the parking industry standard is when you're at 85% occupancy, it's when you should be making parking management decisions. Parking management decisions can be a number of things. It could be changing policy, implementing permit programs, and establishing criteria that starts to effectively manage the curbside. And this is one of the reasons why it's important to understand the implications and why when you see so much red on the curbs is that we have several locations that are exceeding that 85% occupancy impact. Next slide. And so when we talk about the proposed permit zones and policies, this is one of the initial concepts as we talk about how to move this program forward. And what you can basically see is what we're calling the different zones. You can see zone 1, zone 2, and then the Bret Harte zone. And the intention of this particular design would show that the Canal, Bahia, Spinnaker, and Bay Point location could ultimately have a 24-hour time limit, permit only between 3 p.m. and 7 a.m. with the allotment of several 20-minute spaces, or what we like to call short-term spaces that are permit only after 6 p.m. to accommodate childcare and caretakers. So for those short pickup and drop-off locations. For the commercial area, basically having managed parking between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. with a 4-hour time limit, except with a parking permit. It's important to recognize in commercial areas, when you have a permit exemption to posted time limits, it allows a car to be able to park beyond the posted time limit. And between the hours of 6 p.m. and 8 a.m., it would be permit only. So again, for a proposed permit zone, that would be for those overnight hours. In the Kerner area, being able to have, again, that 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. time limit with a 4-hour time limit, and between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., no parking except with a parking permit. Again, an exception for that overnight parking restriction would be those with parking permits would be allowed to park. I want to highlight, anytime we're talking about a residential parking permit program, this does not exclude you from the California Vehicle Code regulation of 72 hours. You would still have to move your car every 72 hours, as well as you would have to move your car for any posted street sweeping regulations as well. Parking permits do not get you out of those requirements. For Bret Park, the proposed concept is 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. with a 2-hour time limit, except with permit, and between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. being permit only. And so the zone boundaries I want to highlight are generalized, and it's intended to exclude private streets, but this was just to give you at least a rough idea of the concept of the locations that would be included. If you can go to the next slide, Jennifer. So how does a residential parking permit or RPP program work? So in the innovation that exists now with parking management is that the permits are virtual. Our license plates are unique identifiers on our cars, and no longer is there a requirement for a physical permit or a decal on a vehicle to manage parking. Parking permits could be license plate based, and they would use license plate recognition or LPR technology to help seek compliance and to enforce the posted regulations. If the RPP program proceeded forward, you would be able to apply, renew, or self-manage your parking permits. There would be an online portal or a website that residents would be able to access and be able to manage their parking permit needs. And residents would be able to also come in physically to a parking services counter or also into the Pickleweed Community Center for in-person application support. It's important to recognize that not everyone does have access to the internet, so we want to ensure that the solution is equitable when we talk about parking management as well. And I do see one of the comments that has come up about handicap placards or disabled placards. And I do want to reiterate that while disabled placards do allow exemptions for parking in residential parking permit areas, they do not exempt you from 72-hour vehicle code rules or from street sweeping. So just to reiterate that policy. So talking about permit eligibility criteria, right now the proposed approach would be applicants would be required to have a valid California driver's license and proof of residency. A California driver's license does not require residency to obtain a parking permit. It just simply increases the opportunity for who is eligible to apply for a parking permit, and only applicable for passenger vehicles. This is something that's really important because many of you have probably recognized the space markings that have basically been installed on the street. And it's important to recognize that oversized vehicles would not be eligible for this program, and a vehicle must fit within the confines of those space markings to be eligible for programs. And that low income pricing, forgive me, the chat keeps popping up and blocking my slides. The low income pricing is eligible for applicants who could provide proof of participation in certain programs like Medi-Cal, WIC, food stamps, CARE, FARA. This is very commonly known for other programs that are basically accepted for other federal or city subsidies, that would be one of the eligibilities for a low income parking permit. Next slide, Jennifer. So when we talk about the proposed permits, caps, and the policies, one of the things that I want to be able to reinforce is that's important when we talk about equitability, is that in 2016, the State Attorney General published an opinion. Mind you, it is only an opinion, but many, many cities and municipalities are adhering to this opinion, is that you cannot differentiate between a multifamily and a single family dwelling. It's important that as we talk about the recommendations and the concepts here today, is that it is taken into account that we do not want to differentiate between a single family and a multifamily dwelling when we talk about equitable access to the curb. So as we talk about the different zones that we highlighted on the previous screen, you can see the estimates of the number of parking permits that are currently suggested for the different zones and by the different types of dwellings. And what you can see over here on the right side is what we are currently estimating as the total number of permits by those residential permit zones that could be allocated. It's important to also account for the undersell. And what the undersell is basically cognizant of is to ensure that we have space for guests. Again, we recognize that this is where you live, and it's important to recognize from a quality of life consideration that you need to have the ability to have visitors and guests. And this is one of the challenges that I will share with you, that when we do start to talk about a residential parking permit program, that does come with the challenge of you not only have to self-manage your own parking, but also the parking of your guests and visitors. Now, I do want to highlight the periphery permit. The periphery permit is something that we're excited about because the opportunity to be able to provide basically more available parking in the periphery for not only a much lower cost, but being able to have that unlimited potential for the number of permits for folks that can park out in those periphery locations. This is something that we know could be a win for the community, and it will take some coordination. And it's also the reason why we highlighted why safety is such an important part of these project goals, to ensure that we could have folks parking in that periphery area located in Zone 2 to accommodate that type of periphery parking. Now for Bret Park, we've outlined the parking permit allocations, again, by dwelling types and the estimated number of parking permits. And when we talk about guest passes, we have not determined a number of what to limit for the number of guest passes that would be allocated. This is something that, again, is very unique to each community and something that would have to be determined. We truthfully have to start first with the residential parking quantities and really get out and determine what that number is. In many communities we've worked with, there's sometimes limits of up to 50 per year. Sometimes I've seen as low as 25. And right now, when you see the estimated number of permits, you can see that we're basically kind of gauging where those numbers could fall. But this is one of those still to be determined. And then you can also see the need for special event permits. This is something that when you start to talk about managing a residential parking permit program, special event permits are also another factor, recognizing that not only that we have events at the school and at the community center, but I might have a baby shower or a birthday party or a dinner party, and to be able to accommodate those types of events is an important consideration when we start to talk about residential parking permit programs. One of the things that I like to highlight whenever we are talking about residential parking programs is to recognize there is no one-size-fits-all solution, as you've heard me mention. And the reality is there are implications on the choices that are made when you start to talk about managing the curb differently and about access. And so again, while there's no perfect solution, that's one of the reasons why we really appreciate everyone's participation in the survey that we'll publish tomorrow, because we are trying to come up with a solution that's going to work effectively for the community as a whole. If you'll go to the next slide, Jennifer. So when we talk about the proposed permit prices, what you basically can see here is the allocation of the permits basically by quantity as well as by price. And right now what we've done is we've done a cost comparison with comparable rates throughout the Bay Area. We've also estimated the cost of program management as well as the cost of living. And so this is something that's really important when we start to talk about how to manage the pricing as proposed for this program. And the fact that we also know from a staffing perspective, as well as the equipment and the requirements to be able to enforce and seek compliance with this program, that's all basically considered into this program as a whole. And it's also important to recognize that when we talk about the qualifications for the low income pricing, again, using standard federal qualifiers is something that's important as well. And you can see we also have placeholders for the potential for daily guest passes. These are all starting points, and when you really kind of balance it out, you can see that the monthly pricing basically comes down to really the cost of a lunch, or in some cases, the cost of a fancy coffee. But we're really looking at that $180 versus $90 for low income, and that would be for the annual pricing. What's important to also recognize, and something that we've talked to the task force about as well, this is a starting point. It's important to recognize that this opportunity for these concepts is truly a starting point of being able to start somewhere, and to recognize that this program would need to be considered and evaluated in an ongoing basis. Not only would the city need to continue to monitor occupancy on the block face, but we would also need to monitor the number of permits sold. We'd also need to monitor the costs of the program and the overall implications and effectiveness of the program, because it's very possible that the pricing could be too low, and it's also possible that the pricing could be just right. It could also be too high, but this is something that would be really important. While we can do as much estimating as possible, the reality is we would need to be sure that this program was monitored very closely to ensure that the price point is correct and on point, so that that way we could ensure the sustainability of a program like this as well. Next slide, Jennifer. So I mentioned the cost of a vehicle and also staffing. Many of you have seen the parking enforcement vehicles in the community, and I think it's important to recognize that high profile nature of these vehicles is something that we want to be sure continues. And the ability to have a program like this and make sure it's successful is to ensure that we have a continuous and consistent compliance oversight. And so we know that with the program would come the cost of an additional staff person, as well as an additional vehicle with the license plate recognition technology, and also a need to update the citation fine schedule, including adding a $50 fine for permit parking violations. It's important to recognize that this would be really kind of that municipal code, municipal penalty schedule update that would be required with the implementation of a program such as this. Next slide, Jennifer. So now let's talk for a little moment here about guest passes. So right now, the initial idea was on-demand guest passes, single-day passes, and how this could work is that residents may purchase temporary one-day guest passes to accommodate visitors or workers. These permits, with whatever permit total cap was set per calendar day, would be on a first-come, first-served basis. Guest passes would be in effect as proposed until noon the following calendar day, and multi-day visits require multiple guest passes, and a guest pass is only valid for the zone in which it's issued. Now, something about guest passes it's important to recognize, because we do see this consistently across the board, is there's nothing that prevents a resident from purchasing guest passes for their own vehicles. And that's something that we have to be cognizant of, because if guest passes are publicly available for purchase, that means that they can be purchased for whatever vehicle they're purchasing it for, as long as it fits in the space. But these are some of the challenges that you would have associated with the program. For the request process, residents will request guest passes through the online portal or in person, either at the parking services counter or at the community center. And right now, as proposed, passes could be requested up to 3 days in advance to allow for staff review, and passes could be available to purchase a certain number of days prior to an event date to prevent dates from being booked out in advance. Emergency requests submitted less than 3 days in advance would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. I think it's important to recognize that there are concerns with peak demand allocation, policies for misuse, and other conditions. Those are all factors that would have to be tied into a program like this, because again, when we talk about having an adaptive solution, it's important to recognize that this first effort, we're going to learn a lot about how this could work in this community as well. Next slide, Jennifer. So now let's talk about the additional elements for East San Rafael and the program elements that are specific to the East San Rafael neighborhoods, focusing on increasing safety and parking supply. So I mentioned this earlier, it's really important, especially from the feedback that we've received, is the importance to clean up and beautify Kerner Loop and Windward Way. It's important to realize that in order for folks to park in these locations and to feel comfortable, to be able to park there and leave your car and traverse there, we need to be sure that we have proper lighting, brighter bulbs, pedestrian level street lighting. We need to look at security devices, including cameras, mobile security trailers, and also noise alarms, so that way people can feel comfortable leaving their cars in those locations. Next slide, Jennifer. Great. And then about extending the public parking supply. So there has been a pilot done in the past where we tried to utilize the elementary school and it was underutilized. What we'd like to do is reintroduce an overnight parking permit program at the community center and Bahia Vista Elementary School. It could be a different price due to the convenient location to fund safety infrastructure. But the important part about this pilot demonstration are the rules. Is that if you have a parking permit that's eligible in one of these locations, vehicles would have to move by 6 a.m. And I must reinforce, these are rules that would be strictly enforced. One of the things that has evolved over the years is that with the technology, we have more flexibility with the ability to enforce policies and the ability to basically disable parking permits because everything is license plate based. So the opportunity for us to be able to have a program like this would absolutely be able to be tied into a program such as this. The other option in zone 2 is something that we are actively pursuing, which are shared parking agreements. A shared parking agreement is something where permit parking is allowed on private lots outside of business hours. And this is where being able to establish these public-private agreements, the potential of being able to park residential vehicles at these locations is something that has evolved greatly in communities across the country. But just like Zone 1 with parking at the community center or the elementary school, it's important to recognize that same with those locations, the policies would be strictly enforced. Is that, again, depending on the business arrangements in those locations, cars would have to be moved. If we were able to negotiate these agreements, the rule might be being off property by 6 a.m. on a weekday. It might be by 8 a.m. on a weekday, but this is something that's really important to recognize, that being able to take advantage of these opportunities is something that has been successful in other communities. But in order to take advantage of those opportunities, everybody has to follow the rules. I also want to highlight, and you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, what are called parking lifts. And parking lifts have become prevalent in many densely populated communities in residential lots that basically increases the capacity for parking availability in those locations. And this is something that does provide that additional parking deck and has become prevalent in several communities and could be an option. It's important to recognize that for Zone 2, the city can also work with any business impacted by changes to sort out employee and business parking needs as well. So this is something where it's a collaborative agreement, and how this ultimately could be a benefit to the communities impacted. Next slide, Jennifer. So when we talk about periphery permit holders, this is something that we've talked about, safety being an important part of this process. And so one of the program ideas was introducing a safe ride home program. And this is something that basically could provide credit for rides between Zone 1 and certain Zone 2 locations by offering in partnership with a ride sharing company. It also could increase access to the periphery parking locations. By us being able to set up a safe ride program, it would basically enable folks to be able to park in those periphery locations and get a ride back to your residence. It's important to recognize for access to safe parking lots as well, is really priority in accessing shared parking lots in Zone 2. So this is something that has worked well in other communities and something where the Safe Ride program we're hoping could help offset and help encourage the utilization of the permit parking locations. Next slide. So something that I mentioned already was special event parking. For special event parking like parties, birthdays, or other celebration, it would be ideal to tie into events so that way the available resources at Pickleweed Park or at the community center. Virtual permits would also be available online and in person, so your ability to apply for those different event locations, you can come in person or apply online. And it's intended to exempt vehicles from certain posted parking restrictions during a scheduled event. And city staff to manage the capacity on a special event parking permit that's active on any day really comes with that balance of capacity of guest passes. And so this is absolutely a challenge. I don't want anyone to think that this is an easy match, but when we talk about, again, quality of life and your ability to entertain, that balance of accessible parking for everyone is important when we balance the number of guest passes along with those special events. And depending on the event size, one or both of the following may be applicable. For a special event permit parking in Zone 1, that would be ideal for small to medium size events with a small administration fee. And for overflow event parking in Zone 2, that would be ideal for large size events with proposed free cost associated with that special event model. Next slide. And thank you, Jennifer. I know you're managing both the slides and the public comment as well. So when we do talk about the financial impact, what you can see here is that high level financial projection when we talk about the revenue associated with the anticipated permit sales, as well as the cost of managing the system, enforcing the system with staffing, the security improvements, as well as the cost for the Safe Ride Home program. And you can see that the program does take over a 4-year cycle to have a net positive result. So it's important to recognize that right now, as proposed, the cost recovery right now is anticipated within 4 years. This estimate includes the consideration for an additional vehicle as well as LPR technology and enforcement staffing. It does include the funding for the safety improvements, and it does include the estimate for the Safe Ride Home program. As I mentioned as well, it is highly recommended that these costs be monitored and continuously evaluated, and it is potential that there might need to be improvements or increases or decreases to different rate models as time went on, but to recognize that this would be something that would need to be assessed in an ongoing basis. For the Safe Ride Home subsidy, it's currently estimated at about $500 per permit holder per year. And this is without negotiation with any of those vendors. This is based on some rough estimates so that we would have some placeholders. Next slide. So now we'll get into the general recommendations, other parking improvement strategies for East San Rafael. Next slide. So let's talk about the community center, and let's talk about the parking lot and the rebalance of the use of the 80 parking spaces. We're looking at plus 18 parking spaces by summer of 25. And it's important to recognize under the current conditions for recreational parking, what we're suggesting is that the proposed changes would take the hours of operation from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. with a 2-hour time limit throughout the entire day. The continuation of no parking between 6 a.m. and 7 a.m. and that overnight restriction of allowing permit-only parking between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. And that, again, could be one of the specialized parking permits. That would be one of those more conducive or more expensive parking permits due to the convenience and the location. For on-street, the adjustment of time limits to encourage turnover and access to the community park as well as the community center resources. Currently, we have our time limit that we are now proposing changing to 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. with a 2-hour time limit. And again, an overnight restriction in those parking spaces that would be permit only between 3 p.m. and 7 a.m. If we can go to the next slide, it's important to also recognize the importance of consistent enforcement and oversight, which is the reason why we made the recommendation for increased personnel as well as the additional vehicle. For the on-street recommendations, as we mentioned as well, the use of short-term parking spaces near the businesses to encourage high turnover, and to eliminate some of the excess yellow loading curbs on Tiburon Street, and to complete the adding of the street markings of the T's and the L's in the ESR or in ESR, and to consider more strict regulations on garbage collection container timing. This is particularly important because those containers can take up very valuable parking spaces. And then also the consideration of restrictions for food vendor stalls and the locations of those as well. We also are recommending considering tightening the usage and removal of temporary no parking signs to ensure additional compliance. And as we're going to the next slide, we are just about to wrap up the presentation, but what I'd like to do before we open it up for questions is on the right side of the screen, you'll see the QR codes to be able to access the survey. The survey will be posted in both English and Spanish. Tomorrow, the survey link will be posted on the city's website, and we encourage everyone to readily utilize the survey and to please share it with your neighborhoods so that we can have as much public participation as possible. I've been told that the survey should take roughly about 4 minutes or so. And what I would also like to share is that the survey is scheduled to close on February 12th. So please be sure to share this link early as available. The recording for tonight's presentation, we're hoping to have it posted by the end of the week. And what we are hoping to have is the recording on the city website, which you'll see here on the bottom of the screen at www.cityofsanrafael.org/parking-permit-program. You'll be able to find the recording. You'll be able to find the link for the survey. And what I'd also like to share right here in the center of the screen is our project email, sanrafael@dixonresourcesunlimited.com, so that you'll have that information to be able to email us, so that you, if you have additional information and you have any additional comments that you'd like to have on there, please communicate via this area as well. And to note that, again, the survey will be published and available, and it will be available until February 12th. So I am going to pause there for a moment. I'm going to ask Jennifer to leave this on the screen. And Jennifer, I'm going to hand the mic over to you for a moment. And I've only seen a few of the comments, but is there anything from the chat that we should address?
Yes, so we've received quite a number of questions and comments. Thank you for the engaging chat so far. I have several questions that have come up from the chat box saved. I will say that given that we have 13 minutes left, we'll do our best to get through as many as possible. But what we can do is for the questions, especially the ones that had numerous people comment on them, we can release a FAQ and have that support the slides when the city does post it up onto the webpage. So one of the first questions that we got was in regards to permit eligibility criteria. Is it necessary for vehicles to be maintaining current registration and insurance?
That's a great question. What most agencies do is they do require the vehicle to be currently insured. Most agencies do not require proof of insurance, because that is not typically the standard, for a, parking permit. But that is something that we can take into consideration, and we will evaluate what other programs have done. In my experience, it has been just that the vehicle needs to be currently registered.
Wonderful. And then another question that has come up in regards to let's see here, what's the question that's been asked quite a bit. Will there be enforcement of parking permits against cars parked across a residential driveway?
So the question, just Jennifer, just to make sure I heard correctly, is will we enforce block driveways?
The question isn't extremely clear, but perhaps we can address block driveways because I think I see something else in the chat regarding that.
You know what, I'm gonna ask if Jim wouldn't mind to speak to how the city currently handles block driveways, because I would love to refer to Jim to be able to speak to how we handle block driveways and if it's complaint driven solely. Jim, any thoughts on that one?
Thank you, Julie. Yeah, the answer is yes. It is complaint driven only. We changed that a few years ago, realizing that added an extra space to people with driveways. So again, if we drive by, we see a car in the driveway, on the street, along the driveway, we're not enforcing it unless it's complaint driven only. You must call into the PD for us to take action.
Thank you, Jim. What else you got, Jennifer?
We did have a question about the permit zones and how they were designated. So the question, I'll just summarize because there's 2 or 3 questions regarding this, is essentially why are Spinnaker, Bay Point, and Canal and Bahia considered one zone altogether?
Do you want to speak to that, Jennifer? I think you're the best qualified for that one.
I can speak to that, yes. So one of the pieces of discussion that we've had with the city is in regards to public parking being an on-street public asset. And when it comes down to who is able to access those streets, it is considered unequitable to designate just specific parking spaces on a public asset for a specific group of residents. And then also in regards to looking at our entire public parking supply overall, we determined that there is indeed, from an overall view, there are enough parking spaces in East San Rafael overall to accommodate the vehicles in East San Rafael. The question is where those people are parking. And that is why we developed the Periphery parking permits idea, with the idea of encouraging those who are parking, perhaps maybe they live in the canal area and they're parking over in the Spinnaker and Bay Points, to consider parking perhaps down in zone 2 if there are elements to make it more safe and easier to access as well. Another piece of why we also group them all together is because there are simply more vehicles in the canal area and in the Bahia area than there are in Spinnaker and Bay Point. And given that we must all share a public asset altogether, this is why that zone has been created, simply because we cannot simply create a zone just for canal, for example. There would not be space for that to accommodate the vehicles there. I'll pause there, and if anyone from the city wanted to add on to why that has been the discussion and the case, I welcome that addition.
Hi, Jennifer, and hi, everyone. I'm John Stefanski. I'm an assistant city manager with the city of San Rafael. No, Jennifer, I think you did a pretty good job, at least capturing just some of the dynamics here. But I think what may be helpful too is, given Dixon's experience as a national consultant in this space, and maybe just highlight the general challenges and the unique challenges that we're facing with designing a program in this neighborhood with these types of dynamics versus what you've seen elsewhere in the country. And so maybe you or Julie can speak to that as well.
Yeah, I will speak to that, definitely. I mean, the challenge is that you are surrounded by water. I mean, that is just the reality of the fact that there's really nowhere else to go. And the reality of what those available resources are. This is one of the reasons why the shared parking agreements is something that we want to be able to tap into available parking assets. Now, mind you, this is being optimistic that private property owners will participate and will comply with this opportunity. It's something that has been very successful in other communities. But the reality is, we're not building a floating parking deck out there, on the water. And we have geographic limitations in this particular area. And let's also be honest, the housing crisis in California is real. And what was the traditional design of a single family or multifamily home is very different than what it was maybe when many of us were growing up. And the reality of the fact that we have multi-generations living in homes today that maybe weren't the case back, several decades ago. And the reality of what our curb space and the limitations on it, this is the reality of what we're dealing with. And I also want to share in something that I know many that are on the steering committee have heard. In California, our legislation continues to change and evolve where parking minimums and parking limitations are being eliminated. I think it's very important that everyone should understand that these laws have been changing now for several years. And the reality of something like a residential parking permit program is something that, as I've been scrolling through the comments here, I can appreciate the restrictions that it put upon you as a resident. But I also want to recognize that in the next several years, I think it's highly unlikely that the state is even going to allow residential parking permit programs for that matter. Because as we talk about new developments not requiring parking spaces for developments within a half a mile of a transit stop, the opportunities to build higher density units on traditional residential lots, these are the realities of what's changing in California. And for those of you who aren't familiar with those policies, I would suggest that that you do become familiar with those, because this is only going to have greater implications and greater impacts into your neighborhoods. And so right now, what you see in front of you is, the city trying to help support what is a very limited asset in the community and trying to figure out a way that we can help bring balance to this asset. And this is a challenge that is only going to get more difficult as we traverse these next several years. And so if you're not familiar with those legislative changes, I would highly encourage that you be aware of those, because the parking restrictions are only going to become more limited. What else you got, Jennifer?
I have seen some concerns about what happens to the businesses who have their employees parking in that area. And I know Jim actually has been in touch with some businesses in the in East San Rafael regarding this. Jim, perhaps you might want to speak to what the city might be able to do regarding businesses and their employees.
Certainly. If you recall, one of the slides talked about the time limits in the commercial zone, zone 2. Please note that that's not going to change during the day. Right now, it's a 4-hour limit from the hours of 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Under our proposal, and perhaps Jennifer can go to that slide real quick, but that's not going to change. So they won't have to make any more adjustments than they're making now. What could change is if they're leaving vehicles overnight. If they're leaving those vehicles stored on a city street during the nighttime hours, that will be something that under the current proposal will not be allowed. They must get a permit, and again, permits are for residents only. So again, daytime stuff will not change. The nighttime effect will be that it's for residents only to park in those zones.
Great, Jennifer, we probably have time for a couple more questions before we want to just remind everybody about the survey. And I also want to highlight what Jennifer mentioned. We will take all of the questions that are in the chat and transfer those over into an FAQ, correct, Jennifer? And we'll make sure that we have responses to all of the questions that are listed and make sure that those are posted on the city website. I'll say on that one, by early next week, I do see some questions that will require a little bit of research on those, but we will ensure that there's an extensive list of questions here, and we will make sure that we capture these and make sure that these are addressed as well. But what else do you have, Jennifer, here in these last couple minutes? Oh, you're muted, Jennifer.
All right, I should be back. A good question to possibly address is in terms of next steps there. I do see a question that has come up regarding what are the options for the program next? I'm wondering if perhaps someone from the city might be able to illustrate whether or not there's an opportunity for this program to not be passed.
That's a great question. John, did you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, so as everyone knows, we've been spending time going through this process as this is a priority that the city council has charged staff with working on over the last 2 years. And this will be going before the city council later this spring for their consideration, as no determination has been made as to whether this program is going to be passed or not. We're going to present it to the city council for their consideration. And as always, an option that will be considered at that time is that this does not get implemented and that the status quo remains as it is. But it's our hope that, through this outreach and through the survey that we get additional feedback from not only the people who are on this call, but also folks in the neighborhoods that will be affected by the program. So we can have even more feedback on what the proposed program is. And then the mayor and the city council will be able to be more informed when they make that determination. So that's where we're at with this moving forward. And again, if you have questions or comments, you're more than welcome to submit them to the email up on the screen.
Thank you, John. That was actually the perfect wrap up because we are right at 7 o'clock. I do want to acknowledge everyone taking the time out of their schedules to attend today's meeting. Here on the bottom of the screen, you'll see the city website location. We'll ensure that the recording of this meeting is posted by the end of this week, beginning of the week at the latest. We will ensure that we have a response to the questions also posted on the same location on the city website. I want to highlight the survey links with the QR code. The survey links will also be posted on the city website tomorrow. The survey closes on February 12th. Please be sure to share these links with your neighbors. And if you have any further comments, you are welcome to send your questions or comments to San Rafael at DixonResourcesUnlimited.com. I just want to thank everyone again for taking the time out of your schedules to participate today. And please do submit your correspondences, submit your survey results, and we'll look forward to staying engaged with you all and making sure that we keep you all posted as to these next steps. Thank you all very much and have a great rest of your evening. Thank you again.